Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alex Walsh, and I, along with Cynthia Martin, will be moderating this talk for the next 45 minutes. And before we get going, I want to let everybody know about a couple of things, introduce our presenter, and then let the presentation begin. So again, thank you for joining us for the 2022 New England College Assessment Conference. My name is Alex Walsh, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this session. There are a few housekeeping items we would like to cover before the session begins. First, with so many people on each session, it's important that everybody be courteous and respectful. Moderators have the ability to remove anyone being disruptive or disrespectful. Please keep your microphone muted if you are not talking in order to reduce background noise. If you have a question, please use the chat box, and you can chat the entire group or myself, Cynthia, during the presentation, and we will hopefully be able to get to it at the end of the presentation, and you can obviously chat at the end of the presentation with questions as well, and also verbally at the end of the presentation if you would like to ask questions that way. To raise your hand, click on the participants icon at the bottom and click raise hand at the bottom of the participant window if you would like to raise your hand at the end of the session to speak. Feel free to use the chat box again and share any additional information with all of the participants. So in addition to asking questions, you can share information with all of us as well. Many of you have resources that will be useful to all of us. You can access the live captions by selecting live transcript and show subtitle on the Zoom toolbar. Please know that we are recording the session, so any verbal or chat comments will be part of the recording. According to New Hampshire law, recording is acceptable as long as participants are notified. If you have any issues with Zoom audio, consider dialing in rather than connecting by phone. Zoom staff will be monitoring for technical issues. Now, on to the session. So I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Mamta Saxena is the Assistant Dean, Academic Quality and Assessment at the College of Professional Studies at Northeastern University. Pronouns are she, her, and hers. Before joining Northeastern, she led the instructional design team at Southern New Hampshire University. She has also worked in corporate and academic settings in the education and training fields, both in India and in the United States. So without further ado, Dr. Saxena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Cynthia. Hello, everyone. Keeping in mind my own identity and layers of privilege, I would also like to share, along with the beautiful introduction that Alex gave, that I am a cisgender, able-bodied, South Asian, brown woman, pronouns she, her. I'm originally from India. And some caveats here and acknowledgements that I may not have the direct lived experiences that I speak of in this conversation today. I, like you all, am also on a journey to learn from our colleagues and community. And in the process of learning and many times unlearning things to adjust my own positionality and perspectives. Because when we think of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the nation in higher education, in the past couple years specifically, I'd like to start out to acknowledge that we are at a place where we need to just stop admiring the problem and get beyond the talk about not the why, because we all get that, but what is it exactly we need to do and how do we move forward? So because we're looking forward for impact, for change in a truly transformative way. And we can do that in our own sphere of influences so that we can move forward from talking about it to action and implementation. However, we should also understand that few sessions on the why and how is not a complete solution. We all know that. Enacting equity in curriculum design and assessment will be a continual effort. It's a process of learning and unlearning and questioning how do we do things, why do we do it in a certain way, and challenge our own assumptions about its relevance, its effectiveness in terms of A, what are we really doing and for whom. So with that, I would start the session. And when I want to do that, even before I share the objectives with you, I'd like to share the importance of equity literacy here. The fact that you all are here at this session today, I'm not sure if this is the last session for the conference, but this demonstrates your interest and your passion to do just that. Your desire to make yourself literate about all things equity, especially in your own sphere of influence or the professional space that you work in. So your desire to continually learn about this topic is commendable, and I thank you all for that, and acknowledge that being faculty or staff, I'm not sure what the group here is in this conversation. We've been inundated with DEI messaging and sessions, some voluntary, some mandatory. I oversee the assessment office at the college myself at Northeastern University. I have 40 plus faculty on assessment that I work with, and I'm aware of the workload, the information overload that you folks have had on top of everything else that you're trying to do, especially teaching and taking care of the learner experience. So I just wanted to thank you for that. But I also wanted to acknowledge that it's very important to make yourself aware and knowledgeable about the terms, the practices out there, because we really need to recognize before we respond or address. And only then we can actively cultivate a culture that cares about equity and sustain it in terms of implementation. So in terms of objective, I have reflective prompts built out throughout the session. In each segment, we can stop and talk about that. There'll be time for brief interactions before we get to Q&A. Hopefully, I'm doing a good job of covering the content before that. I did share a handout with Alex. If you don't have access to that, that's okay. You can use it after the session, but there will be prompts on the screen for you as you take notes for yourself. As I prepped for the session, again, I appreciated the work that NEC has done for you folks in terms of informing the staff and faculty about the why of this equity work. And so the real work is now to help folks figure out exactly how to do the work in the needed space in your professional space, whether you're a designer, a faculty, or assessment professional. But before we get to that, we need to validate the what. What do we really mean by different terms? And again, there are so many terms, as you folks must have heard, that talks about equity, culturally responsive, socially just, inclusive. In terms of that, these diverse words of DEI, it's important to validate them because words matter, context matters. You may be practicing a lot of what I speak of today, but you may not just have put a label to it. So just to get on the same page, we will cover a few terms here. But before that, if you folks can share a little bit in the chat, what do you really want to learn from this session? You came to this session with some mindset. What do you exactly want to get out of this session coming that? And I hope that this presenter is going to talk about XYZ. If you can share a little bit about that in the chat, we'll give a minute or so for you folks to gather your thoughts and put it there.
Just a very quick announcement that handout was just put in chat for everybody.
Thank you, Alex. Do we have any thoughts in the chat, folks? Our folks came with a very open mind, like broad expectations. I can keep moving, Alex, if there's no. Okay, I will do that. It's okay. It is really broad and very diverse. So I will just cover two main terminology. As I said, there are at least 9 to 15 terms that I could list out in terms of the terminology that's floating out there in the past couple of years regarding equitable curriculum design or assessment or pedagogy. But the two that I want to cover, because it directly relates to the design and assessment aspect, first is the culturally responsive pedagogy. Now, this was over 2 decades ago. Gloria Ladson-Billings introduced the terms that really urges us to consider the learner's cultural identity and use it as an asset. So when we speak of being culturally responsive, we are referring to instructors being familiar and aware of the cognitive differences specifically that define the ways in which the lived experiences of learners impact how they acquire knowledge. Because what it impacts in terms of learning is their behavior, their cognition, their communication style, their perceptions of self and others, work ethics, how they collaborate, and all these have a direct impact on how they learn. So in other words, when academic knowledge and skills that you're trying to teach in your class to your learners, if it is situated within the lived experiences of the learners, research shows that then they can make it more meaningful. It generates higher interest and motivation, and it's easier for learners to learn what you're trying to teach them. Another term I want to share is the inclusive pedagogy. Again, these two terms I picked from the list of 15 or 20 or so is because it directly relates to how we're going to talk about design and assessment. This inclusive pedagogy piece, it's again very similar to terms in terms of goals. It talks about sense of belonging and community by being intentional about designing instruction and assessment in a way that supports all learners. Now, how do you do that, and how do you become an inclusive instructor? Here's a quote from Addie et al. In references, I have the authors and the book here. They talk about teaching in higher education that is not solely helping learners with cognitive and skills development, but it's very multidimensional. And it comes with the responsibility of understanding the students' values, their perspectives, the connections and commitments. So mentoring, counseling, advising, empathizing, they all become a critical element of our jobs outside of just designing and teaching. So it's more than creating diverse activities or content. The authors in the book outline 4 characteristics of inclusive instructors. They take responsibility for making their content and teaching inclusive. They own the continuous learning journey about their students, that they want to know who they are. They care about all their students, all in caps, and they change and adapt their content and teaching practices based on evidence and research in terms of doing something with the knowledge. So everybody present here again in the session have brought that mindset with them already, and that is the first big step in the process. So the first journey that starts in terms of inclusivity or equity is you and your learners. So where do we begin now? So first and foremost, the journey begins with you, your own identity and positionality, because that is going to dictate not only your own journey into what equity is all about, but also it influences your practices in your teaching and design and how you're engaged in the institution as an assessor, instructional designer, a researcher, or a leader. And from what I know, you folks have kind of been through that journey already, given NEC doing this conference every year, and last year was also equity focused. So now DEI work has, the work that has to be done at the university, it's to move on to our learners now. And if you haven't, there is in the handout, the identity wheel there and some reflective prompts and question that may help you get there in terms of first identifying who you are, what is your philosophy, what is your lens with which you look at equity and everything around you in terms of learning and learners. So the next step is, once you know your own identity and positionality, the question to ask is, do you know the identities and positionality of your students? Inclusive instructors use the diversity in their classroom as an asset and not as a deficit model, and they leverage the differences to create learning opportunities for all learners. Now, how can you value presence of all identities in your classroom if you don't even know who they are, where they come from in terms of their own identities, their lived experiences? So it's important to understand who your students are. But how do we do this? I'd like to hear from the folks in the session today. What methods do you use to know your students, to learn about them? What are you using currently? If you can share in the chat a few words, a sentence. Boy, this must be the last session of the day, is it, Alex? People are tired of the sessions, I guess.
Yeah, we have one more.
One more, okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. These are loaded questions, and maybe you're still forming your thoughts. and that's all right.
So we have one in chat right now. Here we go.
All right, can you read those aloud for me? I cannot see the chat, Alex.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes,
sorry.
yes. Okay. Sorry, let me go up because now we have, I think, 3 or 4. Okay. So if I mispronounce any of your names, I apologize. Elena wrote demographic data, end of course surveys, etc. Suzanne wrote introductions on the first day of class, something I like to do as well from time to time. Timothy wrote informal dialogue, having lunch with students, attending on-campus events. Suzanne wrote seeing them on campus.
Wow.
We have 2 more if you'd like to hear.
Sure.
Okay. Elizabeth wrote, in previous roles, I'd have students do intros in LMS tools. And then Mark wrote pre-course surveys. And, oh my God, I get mad. Sarub wrote, encourage the students to introduce themselves.
That's great. So thank you everyone for putting that in the chat, and thank you for reading it out, Alex. So looks like a lot of that I'm going to talk about folks are already doing, but hopefully you'll find something novel here that I'm sharing. So that's absolutely right. You know, if you want to learn about your learners and truly understand their lived experiences and their identities, there is institutional data, there's program level data, and there's course level data, right? The call to action here is always ask, explore, and make sure to disaggregate, right? So institutional data is not often clean. So let's start with institutional data. And it's also not accessible. There may be college-wide surveys that go out, but maybe you don't always get the results, or you don't know exactly what the breakdown of the population is in terms of disaggregating the data. So this will be work, right? So if you are not aware of it, again, ask, explore, disaggregate. So you need to intentionally seek demographic info about your learners. At the institutional level, are you aware of all the surveys? I heard some surveys, but are you aware of all the other college-wide surveys that have data points that are available to the institutional research office or university dashboards available, maybe to the public or just to you folks, like exit survey, alumni survey? We have climate survey these days, retention, graduation rates, time to completion, because all these data points about your learners, they tell a story about who they are, where they come from, especially if you break the data down, disaggregate it by race and ethnicity, gender, class, or whatever disaggregation is possible at the college level. Is there help at the IR office or published info that looks into correlations between institutional data that you find and how it reflects the program you teach? This will be, again, a messy thing to do, again, from my own experience, because we all know that we have disparate systems, that don't talk to each other. We have Banner, and then we have our LMS, and we have Canvas and all that stuff. So again, ask, explore, and then how does that then translate into your own classroom? So you may have program level data, retention rates for my program is this, but then what is the retention rate for my course sections that I teach? Where do that data sit, right? So only then you can identify equity gaps and understand the student profiles. So it's going a step beyond just the surveys and in-class intros and discussion boards. Is truly understanding, where they come from based on that disaggregated data, because that'll tell you a story of exactly who are the marginalized in your classroom, and what are those groups that they belong to, whether it's class, gender, race, disability, or whatever the equity issue is. Again, what percentage of any given variable is the makeup of your classroom? And there are so many variables. I just gave you 4. It could be Pell eligibility, socioeconomic status, low income status, financial challenges, first generation students, international students, students with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, then intersectional identities. That's the biggest issue right these days, one person holding multiple identities, and how do you look at them and how do you support them in all ways? Right. So again, rest assured, if information is not readily available, so I'm talking at institutional level, program level data. Again, it's messy, it may or may not be there, but then there is always course level strategies that a lot of you shared already in the chat, right? Invite your students to share that information about themselves in a brave way, right? When it comes to quiz, forums, discussion, surveys, it's not just asking general question, introducing yourself, but giving them the prompt so that they can share their identities in a brave way to celebrate their identities and create a sense of belonging, like index cards. Some universities have developed apps, know your students, or my course analytics dashboard in Canvas, where one can also look at course grades by gender, race, first gen. So it could be a digital tool that your institution have that they can invest in, or through surveys, assignments, discussion, office hours, as some folks said, lunch, having lunch with them. That's an awesome example. Or a welcome video by instructor, where you start out, this is my identity, this is who I am. It kind of invites others to bravely share their own. I'm sharing, this one form, Addy et al., the quote that I shared earlier, it's in the reference list, their books. They share a form that they used in the class. So it's a very concrete, tangible item that you can walk away with today and you can use. It covers general demographic info about, who is an adult learner versus veterans. There's a section that talks about socioeconomic barriers, disability accommodations, and first-gen students, and so on. So this is a form with a lot of very good questions that you can adapt and use to find out about your learners, as opposed to it's just a general survey. It kind of gets deeper into who they are. Another example is from one of my NEU colleague, Lindsay Portney. Her book, Design to Learn, uses design thinking to look at assessment. And she uses this acronym HEARTS, and it stands for what you see in the poster here. Using this acronym, she shares her method of understanding the learner's hearts before we can begin educating their heads. And this is a sketch note that you can go to her website and download and use yourself. And again, it's trying to connect with the lived experiences of the learners in a very dynamic way and inviting them to the learning space and make it more exciting for them if you start your conversation with this, right? So you take the time to learn about your students. Now, why should you do that? And is it, going beyond the surveys? What will you get out of it? Well, the benefits are bulleted out here, right? It helps your design and teaching. Consider financial challenges for, say, Pell eligible or similar students in terms of purchasing textbooks. You may be motivated to resort to open educational resources as opposed to expensive textbook, right? Or technological challenges such as stable internet connections. You may be motivated to be flexible in your hours and in the way you present your information or your content. If you're aware of the cultural, geographical, and other experiences, maybe you'll include considerations when choosing activities and designing the assignments, keeping that in mind. You can leverage life experiences of adult learners in your course. Like if you have veterans, invite them to share their insights with traditional students, right? You can be mindful of first-gen students, offer them more resources and support them that they really need beyond, what other learners might need. Structural inequities are real, we know that. STEM and gender gap in STEM, especially economics discipline and STEM discipline, it's real. So data and evidence will make you curious about equity issues in your discipline. Disabilities is another big source of data, and accommodating that accordingly, it's important. And there are myriad of them, from hearing, visual, mental, emotional. Mental health is the biggest one right now in the forefront, as we all are dealing ourselves and with our learners in our community. It has skyrocketed during and post-COVID. So it's critical to know who need the help, adopt trauma-informed pedagogies that acknowledge the challenges, and builds trust for students as counselors. At the course level, small examples of giving extensions, right? Being flexible with assignment deliverables, the testing space. It's a very small example of, once you know your learners, the empathy follows. If you truly take the time to know the learners, you have that empathy in you as an instructor or designer to say, I need to build that in there to support all learners. So that's the whole point of knowing your learners. The second step toward inclusive pedagogy and equitable practices is syllabus, right? Let's begin at the first thing that you design as you prepare for the course, which is the syllabus. Now, why review the syllabus and what does it have to do with equity? Well, syllabus review is an opportunity for structured inquiry and reflection. It provides a safe space to assess aspects of teaching reflected in the syllabi. given the structural racism in higher ed institutions, syllabi could be just another artifact of practice that could either reinforce the norms that align with the majority, or it could really help the minority, right? So the way you look at it, the lens really helps here. They can be tool for equity-minded practice if we are intentional about it. Syllabi is the first opportunity for faculty to interact with the students, and it could be a very critical tool to communicate a sense of belonging and welcoming for the student. And I have citations here and in the reference list and links that takes you to resources there. This is again from Addy et al., a list of reflection questions here. There's a full chapter in that ebook. How do you make students feel welcome? But I highlighted in the red box here, starting with yourself saying, do you typically think about making a course inclusive? Do you start there when you start drafting your syllabus, or you go right to content? So that's the first question to ask yourself. And there's a bunch of others that you can include. Looks like you folks already do that, but here are some very good questions that you can include as you design your syllabus to reflect on. Now, another guide I am sharing here is as a resource that offers research for the why and strategies on reflecting and questioning when adapting examples from different pieces of how do you put your syllabus together. And I highlighted in red boxes here near the do's and don't. Something as simple as saying, I welcome you to contact me versus, if you need to contact, right? It sets a tone very differently. And it sets a very good example for welcoming versus non-welcoming classroom. Again, the resources here, the link is there for you to reference. And I have this section also in the handout. The third step is looking at your curriculum. Again, I'll pause briefly to see if you folks have, I'm also trying to keep track of time. I have a lot to cover here. So if you have some strategies that you use for equitable practice and design, feel free to put in the chat box. I'll continue to move just so that we have time at the end. So in terms of curriculum, you look at curriculum in three ways, how you pull your content together, you design activities and assignments or assessment. Now, content is, again, willingness to locate diverse content, authors, perspectives, and the entire curriculum that reflects diverse communities. It's important, right? We need to keep in mind, again, the deficit and asset-based portrayal of communities, right? Where marginalized communities need to be shown as strong and powerful and focus on, the cultural richness that they bring, the contributions they have given in the field of education, research, art, sports. So that's where you focus on when you try to bring diverse content. It shouldn't be just the deficit portrayal of it, right? So that's one thing when you choose content, a willingness to go look out for diverse content. And when you do, keep in mind the asset-based model, not deficit. Class activities, again, we like this space to be truly transformative. If we want that to happen for our learners, we need to be mindful of the student backgrounds, right? Adopt facilitation where we offer clear guidelines around discussion, participation, active engagement, check microaggressions, amplify microaffirmations, choose synchronous and asynchronous modes based on equity considerations when you design those activities, cultivate a sense of belonging in a positive community by choosing, diverse writing from diverse scholars. Group projects, make sure you have defined roles, guidance, and use OER as far as you can, open educational resources for equitable access. Excuse me. The last is assignments. Again, assignment focused on improvement and ultimate success rather than grading or just penalizing for mistakes. That's something very important to have that mindset. Feedback on written assignments should be the one that is clear, actionable. More frequent formative assignments with less weight, opportunities from multiple drafts, transparent assignment design. Those are all some examples of how you can be inclusive and equitable when you design curriculum. In the last section, I'm moving on to assessment here. Again, sharing some assessment design strategies. If you have some, please put in the chat because you can save the chat and refer to it later that you use. I'm going to start out with the assessment cycle here, which is, most assessment professionals and faculty are aware of it. So if you view the assessment cycle as a primary vehicle for improvement, not just grading or reporting, we need to revisit it and look at it in terms of how do we define our learning outcomes? how do we design assessments, and how do we look at the data, right? We have to question ourselves, are we paying attention to it to be multidimensional learning when we write outcomes? Are we really looking at the student experiences and identities as we adjust our assignments and assessments? And are we really looking data in a disaggregated fashion? So learning outcomes, I think when you think of learning outcomes, the first thing that comes to mind is Bloom's taxonomy, right? If we unpack how we craft outcomes, we run to this one model of Bloom's taxonomy. And even in the Bloom's taxonomy, we focus really on the cognitive aspect of it. There are the other two. We have affective and psychomotor sections of this particular taxonomy, but we hardly go there, right? So if we really look at all the theories, all the way from Pavlov's behaviorism to connectivism and critical constructivism today that talks about challenge the status quo, we see that we are not really looking at other taxonomies that are non-Eurocentric. And so for that, I have these different models here. There's the affective with an A part of Bloom's taxonomy that talks about feelings and emotions and attitudes. That's important. There's the medicine wheel that talks about trauma-informed pedagogy. There's a spiritual domain from the indigenous folks that talks more about other skills beyond cognitive skills of students, because research says that if you don't nurture those other aspects of the learner, they may not completely succeed in the cognitive aspect as well. And I have links and citations for these to focus on. So learning outcomes is one place that you can focus. The second is assessment methods. We have all heard that good pedagogy is good pedagogy, so it should benefit all learners, but that's not really true of assessment, right? We cannot say that about assessment, because when we talk about best practices in assessment, we don't know who designed them and for whom. Was it the majority culture that dictated those norms? So we need to rethink those practices today. Even after you follow what seems like a good practice, is it possible that we are unintentionally omitting some learners for whom these do not work? And then if that's the case, are we truly teaching and assessing to ensure learning takes place for all our learners? And is it really equitable? So one example of questioning is the high-stake test, the standardized test or high-stake exams that many courses or programs or courses have, right? This is one example I'm giving of research from Dr. Arbuthnot. She offers empirical research on high-stake standardized test. And she claims that different groups' performance patterns vary regarding Black-white achievement gaps here. There is strong evidence that diverse group of students learn and approach assessments differently based on their cultural context. Now, this slide doesn't do justice to her research, so I'll recommend you to go look deeper into her research. But what she's trying to say with her research is that based on the cultural context of learners, we have Hall that define low context culture and high context culture, evidence suggests that cultural background have impact on how students perform and test, even at the item level at these standardized tests. High context cultural groups tend to be more conservative and they solve problems in conventional manner, while low context culture tend to be less conservative. And her research suggests that female and Black students take on conventional strategies in high stakes tests versus whites and males. So these groups perform better on algebra and conventional items versus geometry, measurement, or unconventional items such as graphs and data analysis. So when we look at these differences in research, and there's more research beyond Dr. Arbuthnot out there, we need to ask the question that what are we measuring here? Are we measuring test-taking abilities or cultures or learning, right? Because these test scores have reliability, but they don't have validity. So where do we go from here in terms of models? Universal design for learning, we're all familiar with that. That's one way of looking at designing assessment, where you are looking into multiple means of engagement via different modalities in terms of feedback expectations, right? Or demonstrating learning or mastery. It could be speaking, listening, note-taking, peer feedback, right? Including all methods of expressing students' understanding, giving them those multiple levels of engagement, right? They could demonstrate learning in an oral way, written way, video logs, posters, presentations, drawings, infographics. You can promote student engagement via active learning strategies like problem-based learning, process-oriented guided inquiry learning. We have think, pair, share, breakout groups, because we need to be transparent in these assignments to help them value diversity. We need to provide structure in the course, as structure matters, especially for marginalized population. So if we follow the universal design, again, there's a link there. It talks about all 3 ways of engaging learners in terms of how you engage them with the content, how you represent their learning, and what action and expression they can use in there. Another framework that I want to present here is TILT. It's transparency in learning and teaching. There's a resource link here. Again, it helps faculty and educational developers to keep in mind the context, including assignments, curriculum, assessments, and strategic initiatives, and look at it so that everything is transparent in terms of why you're doing it, what is the task that you're asking at hand for the learners, and what's the criteria. Again, the link is there. And there are some other assessment strategies. It's a long bulleted list here. It's not the exhaustive list here. But a lot you can do in terms of scaffolding learning and looking at how you look at tests and exams, grading strategies, including student voice and rubrics design, getting their feedback, disaggregating data at the course eval level, just so that you can provide them the right feedback. And the last thing is the data, right? The National Survey of Student Engagement offers guidelines and tips for inclusive data sharing. I have adapted those questions here for you from a faculty perspective. When you look at any data, survey, their performance, their grades, ask these questions of yourself. And here are some tips and tools for interpreting the data. Triangulation, multiple perspective, disaggregation that I've been saying, from slide 1 here. With that, I think I'll open up with a collective exploration here. If we have 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes, to talk about, what success and challenges, that you see when you think about practical strategies. What do you want to talk about? I'll just open it up, Alex, for any Q&A. People can unmute themselves, whatever works.
Sure. So while everyone is thinking, there were a couple things in chat to get to. Number one, you talked about links at a couple points throughout your presentation. Where are those links available for everybody?
So I will make I have the presentation I'm going to share, Alex, with you. I'll share the PDF with you. All the links are built in there, and also reference list at the end of the presentation. I'll share that with you. And the handout also has links in them.
Okay. So, So Gavin Henning, who runs this for everybody, Gavin Henning, who runs this conference, I think he sends out recordings next week at some point, and he also sends out materials that presenters use, like PowerPoint. So next week, all of you will have that available to you through Gavin. All right, and there was one more. When you were talking about those, I think it was the pre-course surveys and all the data. Okay, so there was a comment that students may think that we are asking too much personal information of them. So I don't know if there's anything to make note of there.
Yes, no, that's a very valid question. And I've heard that before, even at my own college. There is a balance, right? There's a sense of trust that you have to build even before you delve into that. When it comes to institutional and program data, if your institution is collecting and making it available, it should be available. And I'm thinking about my own institution, given the call for equity, the major points of data, retention, graduation rates, even the climate survey data, depending upon the number of responses. Now, if the response rates are low, privacy is a huge issue. But what we've come to learn is that even if the N is small, that doesn't mean that we don't look at it, because this institutional and program data, it's shared only with the faculty and the leads. And it's, in essence, it's with the intention of doing something about it. Just because the N is small, there are only 5 students, doesn't mean we do not look into the qualitative data that we shared, their concerns. It has to be looked at. So we have to get beyond this thing that privacy is an issue. We don't have to look at exactly who it came from. Even if it's N is 5 and it's coming from a core section, we need to do something about it. So institutional and program data, that's how you deal with it. We cannot just continue to say privacy is an issue, so we're not going to look at that. But at the core section level, it becomes very personal. You have your group of students. You have to build that trust and, the sense of belonging and community first. And I just hear you, it is difficult. You build that, give them a space to bravely share what they want. And again, at all times, there are protocols, right? Like if it's a conversation, you don't record it. It's not to be recorded, but then you also make sure you make the learners understand that they're talking, it's not recorded, and it's just a classroom conversation. But at the same time, you also have to check with the DEI office, if there are other concerns that comes out of that conversation, how do you deal with it, right? And not all institutions have figured that out. But for us, we have to connect with someone in DEI, have a script ready, and before we have hold those conversations in the classroom. And those are loaded conversation and tough conversation. I don't have all the answers for that, but I truly hear your concern that it is tough. How much is too much, and how do you really understand and give them a brave, open space that they feel comfortable sharing it without violating any institutional protocols. So it's, again, ask, explore, plan. That's all I can say.
So we have about a couple minutes or 2 minutes, and then we'll need to go. We have something to the value of using single point rubrics. So Mark is asking, can you speak to the value of using single point rubrics?
Yes. So we've been, the assessment community, I think about AACU rubrics, the LEAP rubrics. We've been harping on this analytic rubrics, right? We have 4 criteria and they're huge. But over time, I did my own research at my own college and talked to so many faculty. It works for some and not for others. And it's not like a good solution for everyone. And what I found was that folks started using these analytic rubrics and it became very mechanical, right? They're checking the box, putting the points in, and the feedback is suffering. So I'm researching and finding this new wave of rubrics revolution, where they're saying, single point rubrics are most important because then you're focusing on the feedback and you talk to them. This is what the expectation is. And then when you give feedback, all you're telling them is, this is what you did best and this is what you missed. So you have 3 columns. The criteria is in the middle and you're telling them what they did best and what they missed, as opposed to checking boxes and putting points and then taking valuable time away from feedback. And there should be links in the handout or in the reference list somewhere about that. I have myself moved away. We built this huge repository of analytic rubrics. And now we are moving towards, okay, if this doesn't work and it's taking precious time away from feedback, then move to single point rubric, because feedback is what we are finding most valuable for learners, and that shouldn't be sacrificed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And it's 5 o'clock. Time flies, that's for sure. So in the interest of staying on track with the schedule, we're going to wrap up the presentation now. And want to thank all of you for coming. And like I said a couple minutes ago, when you get an email from Gavin next week, you'll have access to the PowerPoint and to these links. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Alex and Cynthia.
Thank you.